Once upon a time, in the small village of Sotoba, Megumi Shimizu took a walk around town on a hot summer day. She couldn't help but think about how much she hated the village and longed to live in the city. As she passed by some villagers gossiping, they made fun of her, and she couldn't help but feel even more frustrated. The only things that brought her any solace were the big house on the hill and her crush Natsuno, whom she often spied on through his window. A few days later, tragedy struck when 2 bodies were found in the Ameri area. Police officer Takemi began his investigation and questioned junior monk Seishin Muroi, who had been performing rites for a deceased villager in Upper Sokoba, before discovering the dead bodies. Dr. Toshio also became involved in the case. On another day, Megumi walked to school with her classmate Kori Tanaka and her brother Akira. But Megumi's frustration with the rustic behavior of her classmates caused her to run off and seek solace at the bus stop. However, even there, she found no comfort when Natsuno ignored her. One night, a moving company van arrived at the roadside restaurant, Chigusa. The driver, Tatsumi, needed directions to the Kanemaset area of Sotoba, and shopkeeper Kanami Yano obliged. Meanwhile, villagers were gossiping about the newcomers, and Megumi decided to explore their mansion up the road. The next day, when Megumi didn't return home, her disappearance caused concern throughout the village. A search party was organized, including Natsuno's father, Yuki, and liquor store owner Tomio Okawa, who brought his son Atsushi. Officer Takemi also went to Kanemasa to inquire about Megumi, but they claimed to have not seen her. After an exhaustive search, they finally found Megumi catatonic in the woods with only insect bites and anemia. Days later, Kori saw the lady from Kanemasa talking to Yasuyuki from the lumber mill. Megumi had a flashback of meeting Chizuru as well. Unfortunately, on August 15th, Dr. Toshio received a phone call with the tragic news that Megumi had died. Toshio was devastated when he received the news that Megumi had died from anemia. As a doctor, he couldn't ignore the fact that her death was uncommon, and he knew an autopsy was necessary. But when he approached Megumi's father to request permission, he was met with refusal. Days passed, and the village mourned Megumi's passing. Seishin led the funeral procession, and Kori, Megumi's friend, tried to give Natsuno a gift that Megumi had meant to give him. But Natsuno, who wasn't close to Megumi, declined the gift. Meanwhile, strange deaths continued to occur in the village. A lady, Tagino, goes to visit Fuki Kotuda, finding Fuki dead. This follows the deaths of her son, her brother, and his wife. The deaths start to attract the attention of Dr. Toshio, with the latest victim refusing to see the doctor. At the Yuki household, Natsuno is in his room after having returned from Megumi's funeral, and suddenly feels uncomfortable and closes up his window, like he always did to prevent the late Megumi from watching him. However, it still brings no comfort as he feels a pair of eyes watching him from outside. Dr. Toshio and his team concluded that Megumi died from an unusual type of anemia, but they still couldn't determine the cause of death. Toshio, Seishin, and Ishida, the town councilman, reviewed the recent deaths and discovered a pattern. 10 people had died in the span of a few weeks, and Toshio suspected an epidemic was spreading. They agreed to investigate further without causing panic among the villagers. The village was surrounded by death, and Toshio knew he had to act fast to save his people. He was determined to uncover the truth behind the strange deaths and put an end to the epidemic before it was too late. Natsuno continues to obsess over Megumi, imagining that she is watching from the forest. On the next day, Natsuno goes to school and meets his best friend, Toru, along with Ritsuko. He hitches a ride with them to Miso, where they later meet up with a fellow classmate, Masao, who intensely dislikes Natsuno. The following day, Masao goes to the library, where he is startled by the librarian, Yuzuki, who looks stoned. Masao is a strange kid, sometimes making inappropriate comments. He has an estranged relationship with his family. Later, Natsuno remembers how he did not want anything to do with the villagers since he moved here until he met Toru. Dr. Toshio still cannot find a source of the anemia-afflicted victims. His childhood friend, Mikiyasu, returns with his wife now, whose condition has worsened. Toshio questions Mikiyasu about whether his workers or clients have been ill, and Mikiyasu tells him that his family met the Kirishiki couple a few nights ago. Toshio knows how sick Nao is, but downplays it to Mikiyasu. Seishin meets Sunako Kirishiki, a girl from Kirishiki Mansion. She claims to enjoy Junior Monk's writing. She notices the wrist scar from his suicide attempt. She snaps at him for calling her Sunako-chan because she hates being treated like a child. Nao passes away the next day from her illness. Masao arrives at Toru's house to announce Nao's death and discovers Natsuno staying over. He almost gets into a fight with Natsuno before Toru breaks them up. Toru goes outside to get a soft drink and meets Tatsumi, who is the Kirishiki's steward. Toru invites Tatsumi to come visit him at his house. Tatsumi ominously tells Toru that he definitely will, and will bring a friend. Akira and his sister Kori sat on the steps, enjoying the last of the summer's watermelon. As they chatted, Akira brought up the unsettling topic of the recent deaths in their small village. Kyori listened quietly until tears welled up in her eyes, and she burst into sobs. Days passed, and the death toll continued to rise. On Monday, August 29th, funeral team caretaker called Seishin to deliver the news of another death. This made it 12 deaths on Seishin's list. As if that wasn't enough, Masaki Toshiro, bookstore owner, called to inform him that Officer Takami had also died. Meanwhile, Natsuno couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched each night. He went to bed every night with a sense of unease, feeling a presence lurking outside his window. Thursday, September 1st, Nurse Ritsuko had lunch at the coffee shop and ran into Masaki, who told her about Officer's death. His family had suddenly moved away without a word of goodbye. Ritsuko recalled that the Shinoda family had done the same thing when one of their relatives had died. What's more, both families had used the same moving company, which happened to be the one that Tatsumi drove. Quickly, old officer had been replaced by a new officer named Sasaki. Next week, Tashio was called to perform resuscitation on Mikiyasu's son Susumu. To his dismay, he noticed that Mikiyasu was also displaying early symptoms of the mysterious illness that had claimed so many lives already. Over the phone, Tashio informed Seishin that kid Susumu was suffering from anemia, just like the other victims. Unfortunately, both father and son were beyond saving. Seishin found himself wandering in the forest, where he unexpectedly met Sunako Kurashiki. She confided in him that she suffered from a disease that made it too dangerous for her to be exposed to sunlight. By September 12th, the situation had escalated drastically. Tashio gathered the hospital staff and announced that 19 people had died since September 10th, with Neo's husband Mikiyasu being the latest victim. They discussed the possible causes of the outbreak and decided to report their findings to the public health department. Meanwhile, Natsuno's mental state was rapidly deteriorating. On the bus ride back from school, he began to hallucinate that his deceased classmate Megumi was sitting beside him. The disturbing images of Megumi haunted him, and he begged Toru to let him stay the night. That night, Natsuno felt a sinister presence in the room and had a terrifying vision of Megumi emerging from under the bed, revealing her fangs and biting Toru on the neck. He awoke suddenly, gasping for air. He had just experienced a vivid nightmare in which Megumi attacked his friend Toru. His heart racing, Natsuno looked around the darkened room, trying to calm himself down. It was then that he realized that it was just a dream. Toru was safe, and he was relieved beyond measure. Meanwhile, Seishin was conducting a tour of the town, visiting the family and friends of those who had recently passed away. His first stop was Masaji Shimizu, who ran a local garden center and had lost his son. Seishin paid his respects and then moved on to Masaharu, chairman of the funeral committee, to inquire about the death of another victim. From there, he went to see the funeral team caretaker, where he learned that several of the deceased had quit their jobs shortly before they died. After that, he goes to the liquor store. The owner, Ukoa, is screaming at everyone. His son Atsushi gets smacked in the face again. Back at school, Natsuno learned that Toru had not been attending classes since the last time he had seen him. Worried, he went to Toru's house on September 17, only to be met with the shocking news that Toru had passed away. Natsuno's nightmare suddenly came rushing back to him, and he wondered if it had been a premonition after all. His mother then handed him a postcard from Megumi, the same one that he had refused from Kori. The postcard had tear stains on it, and Natsuno tore it up in a fit of anger and frustration. Days later, Mazo found himself in a heated argument with his family over his sick nephew, Hiromi. Seeking refuge from the tension, he went to Toru's funeral and saw Natsuno there, paying his respects to their late friend. Mazo tried to provoke Natsuno into a fight, but he was quickly stopped by Toru's siblings and driven away. As Mazo walked home, he saw a man in white entering his family's courtyard. But when he turned to take a closer look, the man had disappeared. As he entered his house, Maso was suddenly attacked by the man in white, who turned out to be Yuzuki the librarian. The strange events in the town were only getting more and more bizarre, and the residents were left to wonder what was really going on. Megumi picked up the torn pieces of her postcard to Natsuno, feeling both saddened and angered by his treatment of her. She couldn't understand why he was so distant and dismissive towards her. On the next day, Natsuno confirmed that Megumi had come to his house and swears that he won't die so easily. Meanwhile, Tashio confirmed Hiromi's death and was deeply troubled by the mysterious illness that seemed to be spreading in the village. Masao, who had been attacked earlier, was now immobilized and unable to call for help. Tashio discovered that insect bites were a likely vector for infection. He loses his patience when his latest patient's wife makes a diagnosis and treatment, despite the seriousness of cyanosis. Later, when Seishin told Tashio about the bizarre occurrences between the deceased victims, Tashio scolded his friend for wasting time on something not related to the illness. As night fell, Sunako paid a visit to Seishin, but he warned her about the dangerous disease spreading in the village. She didn't seem worried, however, and left without further comment. The next day, Masa was found dead. Natsuno rented a vampire horror movie to watch with Toru's brother, and learned about the legend of the Arisen. Natsuno discovered that Seishin had been borrowing books on the same subject and decided to visit his temple. However, when he arrived, Seishin's mother told him that her son was out on business. The village gossip talked about the death of another victim, and the village crazy lady, Akumi, ranted about how the new people at Kanemasa were the cause of the deaths. A lady at Tsuko was in the clinic with the disease, and Dr. Toshio went with a blood transfusion, which helped her feel much better the next day. However, the part-timers working at the Toshio clinic began quitting in fear of catching the disease. When Atsuko didn't show up for her appointment, Toshio phoned her husband, Mungo, and told him to bring her in. She was ailing again, and her condition worsened until she died on September 27th. Later, Natsuno happened upon Toshio in the street and asked him if he was sure of Megumi's death. Toshio laughed it off when Natsuno suggested that Megumi might have revived and joked that anyone who did would be a vampire or zombie. When he asked Natsuno how he came up with the thought, the boy left without answering. Meanwhile, Kaori and her brother Akira spied on the Kanemasa castle, unaware that Tatsumi was observing them from the woods behind them. Suddenly, they were discovered by Natsuno. He sternly told them to leave the area, but Akira revealed that he had seen the owner of the lumber factory, who had recently died, entering the mansion alive. Natsuno realized that both he and the Tanaka siblings suspected something strange about the people at the mansion. Natsuno shared with them his own experience of seeing Megumi after her death. To confirm their suspicions, they decided to go to the cemetery and dig up Megumi's grave to see if her body was still there. Meanwhile, Maso was revived and trapped in his casket, struggling to escape. He remembered how he died. The librarian had attacked him and slowly drained his blood over several days until he expired, unable to call for help. Tatsumi, a special vampire known as a Jinru, freed Maso and explained that he was now one of the Okiyagari, possessing all the characteristics of a vampire. He taught Maso how to survive by attacking and feeding on their fellow human villagers. On Thursday, Yasumori brought his wife, Setsuko, to see Toshio at the Ozaki clinic. Toshio instructed him to leave her at the clinic for supervision and promised to protect her. The following day, Seishin informed Toshio that a sheet of the councilman was missing along with the records of deaths in the village. Toshio believed that vampires were behind the deaths and planned to capture them using Setsuko, a crazy village woman, as bait. He asked Seishin to help him, but the junior monk was shocked by Toshio's plan. In the forest cemetery, the Tanaka siblings met up with Natsuno, and they were prepared to dig up Megumi's grave to confirm their suspicions about her death.